In a recent video, we took a look at 4 early small swords, and I promised we would soon be comparing them and measuring them to see how they kind of stack up against each other, or maybe with each other. Maybe they're more similar than we may think. And this is mainly because these two especially are really similar. So you'll see the structure of them is really similar. They don't have a knuckle guard, they have similar quillins, the grip is similar length, the blades are similar length, the weight is very similar, so it's going to be interesting to kind of check these two out. But at the two extremes then, we have these two swords, which you'll see these are a little bit different in the sense that this one has a bigger hilt. Well, the blade might have been shortened at some point, slightly at least, so it's not complete, but it's similar but bigger. And then we have this one, which is similar in many ways, especially as far as the blade goes, but the hilt is different in that it has a knuckle guard. So we kind of have a comparison of a spectrum, let's say. We have the oldest and most crude, perhaps. Then we have the two really similar ones that I'm not holding right now. And then we have the more elaborate, or the more similar to what is the standard 18th century small sword, even though this is possibly late 17th century too. So in any case, we're looking at 4 swords that are most likely from the late 17th century, with, again, the possible exception of this one, which may be a composite of the 18th century, given the style of the guard here. But whatever the case, what we're going to be looking at today is metrics. So we're going to be measuring, weighing, and just kind of getting an idea of how these swords feel. I might, if I have time, pass them all through the weapons dynamics computer and perhaps post the charts up if I can. But yeah, my point is we're not going to be focusing so much on the style of each of these swords. So if we want to look at the engravings and stuff in more detail, we'll do that in separate videos. So let's jump right in. So we have our 4 swords on display. Hilt-wise, of course, because they still don't fit in my current space, I can't really display them in their full length. That will hopefully be changing by this summer. But they're displayed in an arbitrary order, so I started with what seems to me to be the oldest, which is the one with the bigger hilt here, and then in order of proximity to the style of the oldest hilt, we move down this way. This doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it's a chronological order. It could very well be that this one is older than these two, for instance, or like, so don't let that inform your watching of this video. It's an arbitrary order. But the first thing we can already see here is that the hilt on this one is definitely longer than on the other 3. So this already shows us one difference, and it shows us one communality between these 3. Now, does this mean that this grip is considerably different in use compared to what you would see on the other 3? You would think not, perhaps. The extra length here in terms of pommel displacement, it is basically half a pommel longer than the other 3, so just a couple of centimeters, not much more. But when you do hold it in your hand, you may see it here, there's really a lot of room to move your hand in. You can grip it way up closer and snugly up here. I don't know why you would, but it's possible to do. You can hold it with a kind of wider grip too. So there's definitely a lot of room here to use your hand. And it feels to me like this is definitely closer to what you would see with traditional rapiers, which have a lot of different positions you can kind of hold them in, I suppose. Moving to these, I would say this one is way more, it's a small difference, but this one feels way more like an obligated grip. So you just feel like this is its natural way to hold it. You wouldn't move as soon as you move your thumb up, whereas in the other one, it felt well protected by the fact that the shells here are higher up, let's say, so there's more room for the thumb to move. Here, as soon as you move the thumb out of the quillin, let's say, you're out of any protection from the grip here, from the hilt. So it kind of feels like this is the way to hold it, and that's it. There's also not a huge amount of space to move your hand, like to extend or contract your hand. There is a little bit of room. I'm not going to say it's a tight fit, but it feels like you're more obligated with this one. Moving to this one, Ironically, on this one, you feel a little more free than you did on this one. Of course, this is just my empirical testing. Your mileage, if you had these swords in your hands, may vary. But perhaps the fact that the quillins are longer on this one here feels like even when moving, if you had to, you still feel a little bit more protection. It doesn't feel like your thumb kind of moves out of protection as quickly as it does on this second sword we saw. Now, the guard here is definitely smaller. So let's say frontal or like on the side here, you have less protection than you would have perhaps on this one, although maybe not by much. But it definitely feels more free in the hand. Perhaps even the rings are slightly wider or more shallow, so it doesn't feel like you have to, once the finger's in, it kind of is locked there. But it feels a little more free. Now moving to the last one. This is probably no surprise here, the one that feels the least free. Well, one, you have a knuckle bow, which is one big differentiator compared to the other three we saw. But two, the rings here are at the edge of being useless. So my finger technically fits, but it's a technicality. You wouldn't be able to quickly draw your sword and push your finger through. You'd probably hurt yourself. It has also like a relatively sharp edge here, so it's not something that comes natural. You have to think about it and then pass your finger really slowly. So definitely you're more constricted in terms of use with this grip here. But these are all just my impression. But let's start measuring them more objectively. So I'm taking the straight edge and I'm propping it here at the end of the table, right on the edge. You can't see it, but I'm using it as a means to essentially bring the ends of the pommels here right to the edge of the table, so we have a common starting point to measure each one of them. Okay, and we're there. So we have our trusty tape measure here, and I'll start with the one here on the left. So if we start here, trying not to move it or touch it, we have a length of 104 centimeters on this one on the left, which is interesting because the blade on this one may actually have been shortened too. We'll see that in just a moment. So it may have even been slightly longer, but 104 centimeters. Now, if we move to the second one here, we have a blade that, surprisingly, is a little bit longer. We have 107 centimeters. So not only is the blade longer, but the fact that it has a shorter hilt means that the proportion of blade should kind of be probably more, like the amount of blade, the ratio of blade to hilt. Okay, now moving on to the third one, we have a overall length of 106.5, so about half a centimeter shorter than than the second one we just saw. Okay, it's safe to move them now that I've measured them. And as for the last one, we have a 97.8 centimeters. So definitely the shortest, and not even by a small amount. So there's a difference of practically 10 centimeters between the longest and the shortest of these. Now, as far as blade length goes, I already kind of mentioned a couple of first considerations here, but I'll quickly measure the blade so you have an idea of what is what. So on this first one, the blade reaches 85.7, I would say, centimeters. On the second one, we have a 90.4, 90.5 centimeters. On the third one, we have 90.2 or 3 centimeters, which is interesting because this one is a little bit shorter than this one, but yeah, not that much. So these are actually practically the same. And on the last one here, we have a blade that measures 80, 82, just shy of 82. So 81.8, 81.9. Now, of course, these measurements are affected by the completeness of the swords. Okay, I had to move them out of the way because it throws the focus off. But yeah, speaking of completeness, if we look at the tip on this one, we'll see that it's overall complete. It may be missing a few millimeters that may have been, ground off during sharpening or whatever. It's a little more rounded than I may expect, but it's definitely a complete tip. Same thing goes for this one, which is the third. So if we look at this one, again, the tip comes down to a very, very thin and very regular tip. So I don't think it's missing anything there. It may be slightly flattened, but overall complete. If we look at the second one, we'll see that the tip on this one instead is most definitely complete. It's perfectly sharp to toothpick tip practically. So this one is perhaps the only one out of these we can measure without any degree of uncertainty. And when it comes to this one, unfortunately, as I mentioned, it has this weird tip. It's been brought to a point here, but it's not symmetrical. And it also seems like it's been sharpened more here on the tip rather than here. It's sharp on both sides, of course, but you'll see here, you can actually see the grind marks on this side of the blade. And this is the edge side. If this were a cutting sword, this would be the edge side. So I wonder if someone liked giving quick tip cuts. So just, using this and giving that quick little tip cut. And maybe that's why this was ground in this way, or if it was just a very imprecise job done, like a botched job. In any case, out of the four, this one seems to me like the one that perhaps could have been considerably longer. You'll see here it's still quite beefy at the tip. It could go a longer way, even a few centimeters, before tapering down to an actual tip. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, time to weigh them. And we'll start with this one. I'm going to go in order from left to right. So if we place this on the scale, making sure it's not touching anywhere, we have 551 grams. Now, a few things to keep in mind on this sword, though, are that it may be missing part of the blade, as we mentioned, so a few centimeters there. And what it's definitely missing here is the shells, which would have added a little bit of weight at least. So keep that in mind. It maybe would more likely be around 580 to 600 grams, I think. Time for the second one. So what do you think? Will this one be heavier or lighter than the official transitional rapier, let's call it that way, considering, of course, the lack of the shells? Let's weigh it. And this one comes in at 509. So these are generally quite light swords, I would say. They feel heavier than they are, and I think, especially for this one and the next one, it's because of how blade heavy they are. So, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. They feel very, like the sword automatically kind of places itself straight. But they feel comfortable, but definitely blade heavy. And yet, they're quite light swords if we consider their length. Okay, time for the third. Here we go. We have it here. Let's place it on the scale, and we're at 500. So very close to the second one. And if we consider that the second one is slightly longer, has that half centimeter extra, they're actually probably the same in terms of weight distribution, or at least very similar in terms of weight distribution, or at least that's what I would think by just looking at these first numbers. Now, coming to the last one, as we mentioned, this one is 10 centimeters shorter than the second sword we measured, which is the longest. So we would probably expect it to be lighter. However, you never know, because brass is a pretty heavy metal. So yeah, so we may be surprised. And actually, this one comes in at 542, so about 40 grams heavier, almost 10% heavier let's say 8% perhaps heavier than the two swords we just looked at, and closer to the first sword, which, even though it's missing parts, is still the heaviest of the four. So some very superficial conclusions we can draw just by measuring them quickly like this is that this sword actually matches, I feel, the stereotypical expectation of a rapier. So it does confirm, let's say, its placement in a world that's transitioning away from heavier swords that are actually not as nimble as maybe we tend to think. So even not being the longest sword, it still packs the most weight out of all four of them. Now, granted, we're not looking at huge differences, but still on these weights, they're about 10% difference between the heaviest and the lightest. So that does say something. If we look at these two, on the other hand, these are, as I mentioned, really, really similar in the handling, and they prove to be, to me, honestly, I mean, they all feel nice to handle, but these have a characteristic of blade heaviness to them, which personally doesn't bother me. I find it rather pleasant, but it does say something in terms of the handling of these two swords compared, for example, to this one, which does not have that. This one seems to have more weight down here in the hilt, and that's probably because the hilt is bigger. So it feels more balanced overall, I would say. Now, as a non-practitioner, especially non-practitioner of small sword, I can't tell if this is a good thing or a bad thing, that these are a bit more blade heavy. As I mentioned, to me it feels comfortable. I like that pull towards, that down pull at the tip. But I'd be very curious to hear from people who are practicing rapier and small sword, because I'd like to understand your insights as people who use these swords. Now, the big surprise perhaps is this one instead. So at a way shorter size, this one ends up being the second heaviest, and you can actually feel this in the, it doesn't feel heavy. Ironically, it feels lighter than these two, but we have those 40 extra grams on these. Now, is the weight distributed in the hilt? It's possible. Or is the weight distributed in a blade that's a little more fancy and perhaps thick? That's a good question, and it's something we're going to try and find out right now by trying to find the balance point on these four swords. And for the super scientific experiment, we have a bit of string here with a knot. So we're going to slide the blade through and find, with the maximum precision possible and holding the blade, let's say, in the direction it should be held, so vertically like this, we'll try and find the balance point. Now, this is more precise than using your finger, let's say, so it should enable you, as long as you don't end up moving the string once you find the spot, it should enable you to really pinpoint. And I think we have a balance point. So the blade is slightly oscillating, but overall it's not moving either tip side or hilt side. So I'll place this down, making sure we don't move it at all, or as little as possible at least, and trying to keep also a visual reference for where it is. So it's just about 0.5 centimeter to the right of this little nick. And now we can measure it, taking as a 0 point the start of the blade here. So we're at 10, 13, 12.7, it seems to me. It's probably 12.7. 12.6, 12.7 centimeters up the blade. But we probably also want to include the hilt in our measurement. So again, I'm zeroing in the hilt here at the edge of the table, which you can't see, but it's right at the edge there. And now we can measure from the edge to the balance point, which has not moved, I see. And we're at about 31 centimeters. So balance point is at 31 centimeters. Let's move to the next. Okay, so sword number 2. We do the same process. Also, if you try this, keep in mind that the more swords you pass through the knot here, the more they risk kind of cutting the thread or the string. So just keep in mind, if you have really precious swords, to check your health of your string here between swords, because you wouldn't want to probably drop a priceless sword onto the ground. So here we're still blade heavy, so let's move it a little to the right. Still blade heavy. I did mention it was a blade heavy sword. Still blade heavy, actually. But I think we're now getting very close to that balance point, which we passed now. It's really a matter of just a few millimeters sometimes. And we have balance here. This is balance. So, of course, it depends how precise you want to be. A finger measurement could probably be sufficient, but okay, let's try and improve the process and already place the sword at its 0 point on the edge of the table before we remove my hand here from the string. Okay, we can measure. So, from the ricasso to the balance point, we're at almost 17 centimeters, 16 and a half. I think you have a better view actually from the camera because it's centered. I'm a little offset, so it seems to me like it's 17 and a half, but I'm not sure. And now measuring, including the hilt here. So here we have 33. So a balance point of 33. So if I don't remember incorrectly, the other one also was around 30. So the balance point is not that different. Time for the third sword. And this one is the one I'm really curious about because it feels so similar to the one we just measured. So I'm really curious if it balances in the same way too, or if perhaps we're going to find, like, the measurements are very similar and the feel is very similar. So I wonder. But first, let's try and get that balance point measured before getting into comparisons. So here we're tip heavy still. Now we're hilt heavy. So you really see it's a matter of millimeters in many cases here. So maybe this, yeah, we have balance here. Perfect balance. Okay, let's drop it down. By now, our method is tested. Okay. Yes, time to measure. So from we had said it was, I think, 17 in the previous sword from ricasso to balance point, and then 33 from tip of the pommel, let's say, to balance point. And here we have a considerably different balance point. It's only 11 and half centimeters. Again, I'm a little offset, but I'll check in the video better. But about 11 and a half centimeters. That seems almost, did I read them correctly before? It seems way off for how similar they feel. So I don't know what's up. But measuring now the full length, including the hilt here. No, it actually seems like instead it's correct because we reach a 28, I seem to see. So 28 centimeters, which is, yeah, 5 centimeters less than the previous sword. Now, granted, this one was half a centimeter, but that doesn't justify or shouldn't justify such a big discrepancy in balance point. But most of all, for me, is how similar they feel in the hand. So how does such a difference in balance point justify such a similar feeling in the hand? This is puzzling, to say the least. Okay, and let's see if we'll have any other surprises with our fourth sword. This one already, I think, was surprising in terms of weight, but will that translate also into a surprise in terms of balance point? I did mention it was hilt heavy, and that seems to, just by looking at where I'm measuring now, that seems to confirm what I was saying. Now it's still tip heavy, we need to move it a little. Now it's hilt heavy, so somewhere here. Are we good? Yeah, we're good. And that's why, by the way, you may want to have kind of a slip knot here so you can fit the blade kind of snugly in the loop and not have it just slide around, because otherwise when you let go of it, it might move or flap around a little more. So we're zeroing it in at the edge of the table here. And we can now measure. So in terms of distance from the hilt, from the start of the hilt, we're not even at 10 centimeters. So we're at about 9.5 centimeters, so definitely hilt heavy. And if we consider the full length of the sword here, of the hilt, we get to about, well, it's easier in inches because it's a literal 10 inches there. Much closer in terms of the balance point to the start of the hilt, but when we include the hilt, it's not so far perhaps from this one, because this is 25.5 or something, this one was 27. Okay, so overall, some very interesting insights, I think. These two swords appear to be in the same ballpark, quite similar in terms of balance point, but we do have to consider that this one would have likely had a longer blade, especially if we compare it to the other blades we see here. They all end in a very narrow spear tip, so there's no reason to think this one would have not also had the same kind of tip. So we have to keep into account that this one would have been longer, and so the balance point would probably be tilted a little more towards the tip. However, the opposite can be said about this one, because what this one is missing is its wire wrapping, or at least some kind of wrapping. Now, I have to say, I don't see here like deep grooves showing like a thick wire like this, but it would have been wrapped in something most likely. So while this one would have been slightly moved towards the tip, the balance point, if we include the wire wrapping here, which would have added negligible weight, maybe, but still would have contributed a little to move the balance point, probably towards the hilt. Now, this one, on the other hand, feels extremely similar to this one, at least to me. Very similar sizes, and also if you look at the hilt here, it's a little bit smaller, but not that much. But the balance point is way closer to the hilt here in measured effect, not in feel, I would say. Now, this could be due to a series of things. It could be that the guard here is thinner or lighter than this one, because this one has to have this enlarged section where you kind of house the shells in. Obviously, you'll see that the quillen block, sorry, the ricasso block here is thicker. In this case here, there's way less material, and the same goes for the quillins. Although these are longer and these are thicker, so I don't know if they balance out or not. This one also has this very thick wire, and this one has a full pommel, whereas this one has open work. So these all may contribute to bringing the weight slightly towards the hilt compared to this one, even though they look so similar. And then when we look at this one, I think what the interesting thing is how hilt heavy it is, especially for being such a short sword. Well, actually, maybe that's not maybe that shouldn't surprise us, because being shorter, it has less weight down on the tip side. But it's probably also due to the fact that the whole assembly here is bronze, which of course adds weight. And let's not forget, it has this whole knuckle guard here, which is non-trivial weight when we consider the overall, the overall assembly, let's say. But let's take a few blade measurements as far as thickness and width are concerned, because that could also tell us something. So I'll move these swords aside, because again, they tend to throw focus off, and we'll start from left to right. So if we take the ricasso area here, we have a width at the, let's say, closest to the ricasso. We have a width of 2.3. Is that 2.3? Yeah. Right? Yeah, it's 2.3. 2.3, and a thickness of the blade of 0.7. Yeah, 0.7 centimeters. So fairly thick here, I would say. Thicker than you would expect just looking at it. And this is, this is a very, very solid blade in this area here. It does not flex much, it does not bend much. And to be honest, it's a fairly stiff blade overall. Now, if we move up towards the halfway, I would say, of the blade, the thickness goes down to what is that? 0.4, I think. So it almost halves by the half point of the blade about. And in terms of width, we're at 1. What is that? 1.5. So we have a increased ratio of tightening on the thickness of the blade rather than on the width of the blade. And as we get towards the tip here, we'll see that the blade stays rather thick, so we're still not even at 1 centimeter, we're still around 1.4, 1.4, so it actually doesn't thin further towards the tip than what we already measured at the center point. But in terms of thickness here, now here we see that the blade becomes a thin boy, so it's at 2 millimeters. So it really, and you can feel that in terms of the flex here as well. So how this would have tapered down in its original tip, unfortunately, we can't tell, but we have a few metrics as far as its distal taper and just the general taper of the blade goes. Now, let's take a look at this one. Oh, by the way, you may have noticed the first one we saw was a lenticular section, whereas this one has a diamond cross section. So they are similar as far as the hilt goes, as far as just the looks, but not in terms of how the blade is built. Okay, so this one, on the other hand, barely reaches 2 centimeters. So we're at 1.7, I would say, at the thickest part. And with a thickness here of 0.5 maybe. So considerably thinner than what we saw on the first sword. Now this, again, seems to match that what we're talking about, so that first sword being a transition from the heavier rapier blade into something a little more wieldable, but still close to that rapier blade. Whereas this is, it's still a super solid blade. There's no flex in it at the base here, but it's considerably thinner and also considerably, the width is considerably lower. Now, if we move to the center of the blade-ish, we can measure again the width here, and we're at 2 centimeters maybe. No, sorry, we're not at 2 centimeters. We're more at 1.6 and a half. 1.6 and a half, so it tapers, but very, very slightly. This does not kind of considerably lose mass. And in terms of width, here again, somewhere at the center, we're at we're at 0.4, which, yeah, this one was what was it? 0.5. So we don't lose a lot here. We saw a way more considerable reduction in mass in the first sword in terms of the halfway point. This one is still very similar to how it is at the ricasso. So it just loses about 1 millimeter in width and a few millimeters in 1 millimeter in thickness and a few millimeters in width. And if we look at the flex, that's kind of confirmed here. It flexes a little bit more, but just because it's further away from the hilt, but it's not a blade with flex. Now moving to the tip, and here finally we can actually measure the tip itself. We'll measure just before the tip because, of course, there's no point just measuring a tip. But here we go. So at almost the tip, we're at 1 centimeter, maybe 0.9. And then in terms of thickness, we're at yeah, 0.1 millimeters or something. So of course it tapers down towards the tip, but it's still around 1 centimeter, just a couple of centimeters from the tip. So it doesn't taper as much as we'll see in the upcoming two swords. And here we have our third sword. Now, you'll notice that this one also has a diamond cross section, but unlike the other one, which is a pure diamond section, this one seems to be hollow ground. So, interesting. What does this say? I don't know, but how this translates into numbers, that we'll discover right away. So, at the ricasso, we're at, what is this? 0.8. 0.8, maybe no, 0.8. Okay, and in terms of thickness here, so maybe a little bit thicker than the second one we measured here. And in terms of thickness, we're at, oh no, sorry, in terms of width here, we're at, what is that, 1.8 centimeters, I would say. Yeah, 1.8 centimeters. So, similar to the previous one we saw, that shouldn't be too surprising, but I think I'll check the numbers later. I'll have them somewhere up here on the screen. But yeah, slightly, I think maybe slightly thicker than the other one. Now, if we look at the midway of the blade here, so we said 1.8. Now this one tapers down a little bit more than the other one. So we go to 1.2. So it actually loses about 6 centimeters between the ricasso and the midpoint of the blade. And in terms of thickness, we're at what is that, 5 or 4, 4.5 maybe, 0.4.5, 0.4. So yeah, it does drop more considerably than the other, which maybe explains why the other one is more blade heavy. And again, going towards the tip, the earlier one we measured around here, so a few centimeters away. But you'll notice that here, even if we go 10, 15 centimeters from the tip, we have a considerable drop, a considerable taper. So if we look at where we were earlier, more or less, we're under the centimeter here. We're about 0.8. And in terms of width, we're at, well, 0.1.5. So yeah, interesting. This one tapers more considerably than the previous one. And if we look at the last one here, we can again start by measuring the width at the ricasso. And here we're at 2.3, 2.2.5 about. And in terms of width, we have 0.5. So this is not a thick blade at all. Or at least not as thick as the other ones, which again adds to its hilt heaviness, because if at least it had those 2 millimeters more of width and it didn't have the fuller, which the others don't have, for example, it would maybe be a little more biased towards the tip. Now, looking at the center point, we have about 1.2, 1.2.5 maybe, which if we consider that this one was 2.2, it drops by 1 centimeter about halfway up the blade. That's a lot. It basically almost halves. And in terms of width here, we have, it doesn't go down that much. We're at 0.4. And in this case, here at the tip, the drop is even more dramatic. We're now at just a few centimeters from the tip. We're at 0.9, I think, 0.8. And width is, well, nearing 0.2 millimeters. So actually, what we see on this sword is a way more dramatic drop at the start here, but then it stays rather, it doesn't drop as much as some of the ones we've seen before towards the tip. But it's overall a more flexible sword due to that big drop. You can actually see it here too. As soon as you get away from the fuller, here you still have a very beefy section of blade, but it kind of, by here, it starts really tapering down. Okay, so what does all of this tell us? Well, not much. I think probably all of you will have drawn some conclusions, and leave them in the comments because I'm curious to see if your conclusions based on what we've seen today are similar to mine or even similar to each other's. It'll be interesting to see what y'all think. I will be plotting the data for these swords into the weapons dynamics computer, so we'll actually be able to see a visualization of how these changes affect or differentiate these blades, if they do. So stay tuned for that as well. I'm not sure I'm going to put it in this video because I think it's already rather long, so I might discuss it in a further one. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye!